Like many of you, some of my best childhood memories involve my grandmother. Grandparents have the privilege of spoiling their grandchildren, loving them unconditionally, and then passing them off to the parents for any disciplinary action that may be in order. Granny Jo loved me through and through. In fact, she seemed to love everyone. That was just Granny. But in the spring of 1981, I discovered another side of Granny Jo that I had never imagined before, and that was her strength. It was at her husband's, my grandfather's, funeral that I watched her sit calmly and with dignity as she received all the visitors and well-wishers. I was amazed to discover this jolly, seemingly happy-go-lucky flower of a woman was in truth a steel magnolia. She did not fall apart in front of others. She was a perfect lady. When I have to hold it together under difficult circumstances, if I can think of Granny Jo, I usually discover a strength I never imagined having. And in fact, I feel inspired just looking through old photo family albums, portraits, snapshots of Granny Jo, with all the memories that are associated with her. This morning's passage from the first chapter of the book of Ruth, verses 1 through 18, is like an old family photo album. It's the familiar story of Ruth and Naomi. And as we hear the story once more, we're also inspired by Ruth's devotion and commitment. And we can draw strength from her story, strength that supports our own lives of faith. She was a rock-solid kind of woman. She stuck with her mother-in-law, Naomi, through thick and thin. In fact, her devotion was so strong, Scripture says, that when she was encouraged to go on her way, Ruth refused to leave Naomi, but instead clung to her. Words that reminds us of the psalmist whose relationship with God is described by the passionate words, "You have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I sing for joy. My soul clings to you." But words which also remind us of the love between the two life partners described in the Genesis creation story. Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. The same words of passionate devotion and commitment that are used to describe the love between a man and woman in Genesis are the words used to describe the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. And for me, it's amazing to think of how committed Ruth was to Naomi, considering her circumstances. For one thing, she clung to Naomi despite the loss she had recently experienced. All of a sudden, life was taking a turn for the worse for Ruth. There was certainly the emotional loss that goes with losing a spouse, but there was also an economic loss that she was experiencing. Suddenly, there were no men in her life, and so Ruth was without a protector or supporter. Her circumstances may have been much like many people today who, after years with a company, find themselves faced with early retirement if they're lucky, or simply laid off if they're not. Suddenly, out of the blue and without warning, things have taken a turn for the worse, and you don't know how you're going to make ends meet. It's almost understandable that people who find themselves in these circumstances would blame God for their misfortune. It would be reasonable if their faith was shaken, or even if they lost faith in God altogether. When Ruth looked at Naomi, she could have seen her mother-in-law as a symbol of all the loss she had experienced. She could have regretted the day she ever laid eyes on Naomi, Naomi's husband, and her 2 sons. But she didn't. She was faithful. Despite the loss in her life, she clung to Naomi. When loss occurs in your life and in mine, do we cling to God? Or do we wander around in utter confusion? Do we draw even closer to God, or do we turn our backs on God in anger that God would allow loss to happen in our lives?